Hi, I'm Freeman White and thanks for watching. In this video I paint the rolling hills of Timelapse Peak, which is a local landscape around here that I've painted many times. I show you how I go on location to paint a plein air study that helps me to put some of the feeling of being there back into my studio painting. We then look at the full process of a studio landscape painted in oils. And I've also added a special feature on mixing greens where I give you 9 color combinations that can mix a wide variety of greens to suit almost any landscape painting. So I hope that you get something from this tutorial, but most importantly, keep painting, keep experimenting. It's okay to make mistakes. In fact, that's the best way to learn. So without further ado, let's get started. I just love being out here. It's so awesome. You know, we're pretty lucky to have such incredible landscapes like this here in Hawke's Bay, and I can never really take it for granted. I think being a plein air painter and a landscape painter, that's the sort of thing that gets me up here. To see views like this, not only that, I get to paint them. Now those paintings become the physical memories of my experience here on site, and they're absolutely intrinsic to my process when I'm back in the studio. I can tap into these memories of being on site, and that helps me to get some of that feeling back into my studio paintings. Okay, now something I often get asked about is mixing greens. So what I'm going to demonstrate today is a combination of 3 different blues and 3 different yellows that will give you a multitude of different mixing possibilities for green. Now, it's actually a very complicated subject and something that I've kind of simplified here a little bit, because normally I would also add pre-mixed greens in there, or possibly also transparent copper azomethine green, like a green gold. But for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to embark on the color mixing using French ultramarine blue, phthalo-cyanine blue, and turquoise blue, cadmium yellow light, gamboge yellow, which is originally a naturally occurring pigment from the sap of a tree, and transparent iron oxide yellow, which is actually a rust pigment, but it's one of my favorites. It's also beautifully transparent. Now, there are obviously more blues and more yellows that you can make combinations from, and often I'll use things like yellow ochre to mix in with. This is really just to show some of the combinations that you can achieve. Now, using the French ultramarine blue will give you a muted, darker greens without a lot of high chroma. So let's have a look. Even with the cadmium yellow light, you'll see how this slightly warmer blue actually mixes down into an earthier tone. We're going to go across the palette now using the same cadmium yellow light and phthalo-cyanine blue, which is going to give us a lot brighter mix. Obviously, if you mix more of the cad yellow light in there, it's going to create a lighter green. Now, I'm not even going to use any white in this color demonstration, it just becomes far too complicated. So here we go with the turquoise. Now, in my experience, turquoise and a light yellow, like cadmium yellow light, will actually mix a very bright green. So here we go. That's actually mixed us a really vibrant, bright green. Now, if I'm actually using that color combination in a painting, I'll often knock it back a little bit with my transparent iron oxide or a earth pigment like yellow ochre. However, what we're going to see here is when we use this transparent Gamboge yellow, we're going to see quite a different set of color combinations using our three blues. So here we go. This is a bit of a warmer yellow, and what we see here is actually that the transparency of that yellow influencing even the French ultramarine, which has a high tint power. This is a really nice sappy type of a green. Now, mixing this with the phthalo-cyanine blue is going to give us an even more transparent green, because both of these pigments are naturally quite transparent, but you'll see that depending on the ratios that you mix, still actually quite a dark green. Look at that, but it's got this beautiful transparency to it. Now that actually looks a lot like a sap green that you would find out of the tube. Part of the reason for that is because sap green mixes often contain phthalo-cyanine. Now for the turquoise. Now what this does is it's actually quite nice. The warmth of the Gamboge yellow mixes back the cool turquoise, and actually it warms it up a little bit and creates a very vibrant leaf green. So you can just see all of those different combinations already just with the mixes that we've been experimenting with. Imagine all of the color combinations that you can actually achieve through combining these green mixes together, which is something that I may not do today because it's going to get a bit messy. But here we go. So with the transparent iron oxide yellow, it's going to create some nice transparent mixes that tend a lot more towards the browner side of the color spectrum. Now I really love this because it gives me some of those earthy notes that we often see in autumnal colors. If we're painting in an autumnal scene, I'll tend to use quite a few mixes containing this transparent iron oxide yellow. Obviously, the proportions that you mix are going to alter the end color mixes too. But using this phthalo-cyanine, we get this beautiful, deep kind of oceanic green almost. Look at that. Now, if I add more of that transparent iron oxide pigment, it's going to warm that up a little bit more, and you can see how that's altering the final mix. So here we go. So our final mix for this demonstration is the turquoise and transparent iron oxide. Now this is quite interesting because what it's giving us is almost a verdigris type copper green, which you do see occurring in nature. Now you can see from these different mixes just how much a different yellow is going to influence the same blue, and also how different blues are going to influence the same yellows. So there we go. We've got 9 different combinations. Now there's nothing stopping us from actually mixing all of these combinations together. I mean, I could sit here all day. Just to complicate matters, what I've actually done in this painting is introduced a number of pre-mixed greens. But this is English green, Spectrum green light, Australian leaf green, and Australian green gold. All of these colors allow me a different starting point. Now this one is actually a copper azomethane transparent green, which I tend to layer up over the top of combinations that I think are getting a little bit fluoro. I'll brush that out, but you can see how transparent that is and warm. It's beautiful. Australian leaf green light. This is less transparent and a little bit darker, and something that I tend to use quite a bit, blocking in areas of shadow on grass. The Spectrum green light is also less transparent than the Australian green gold. It's more opaque. Often I'll use it in combination with any of these yellows or blues. I just find having these pre-mixed colors gives me a really good starting point to go back to when I want to mix a similar green. Now, a lot of these greens are also heavily mixed down with colors like Naples yellow, which is a very warm earth tone, a warm yellow earth tone, which is also not particularly transparent. So let's have a quick look at that and see how that gives us some beautiful autumnal dry grass notes. The English green light, in a way, it's kind of more similar to this color combination up the top here of the turquoise and cadmium yellow light. But once again, it's something that I do use. It sort of speeds up the process of getting to that bright green. So if I want to make that even brighter, I just add cad yellow light to it. If I think it gets too bright, I can knock that back with a bit of the Australian green gold. And I'll often do this actually in successive layers. So I will layer up to that final color instead of actually mixing all of the color combinations together on the palette. Now, it gets even more complicated because I'm gonna add burnt umber into this palette, which is going to give me the potential for mixing dark blues. Once I've added white on top of that, it's got so many combinations. I've got combinations coming out my ears. Now I start by drawing in the composition using a 2B pencil. You don't want to use a pencil that's too dark because it will leave a lot of graphite behind, and that graphite can mix in with your paint layers. Now I've actually made a couple of measurements. I printed out my reference and I've made just a few measurements to make sure that I got the composition on there that I wanted. This is a really important stage because everything else hinges upon you getting this underdrawing right. Here is a list of all of the paints that I've used in this painting. Now I should mention it does slightly differ from the paints used in the color mixing demonstration, as I have more than just greens to mix here. Here is a list of all the brushes that I've used in this demonstration. Now I only use one painting medium, and it's this lean medium. This is a liquid medium that I use instead of turpentine. Now once I'm happy with the underdrawing, I start blocking in. Here I'm using a combination of Van Dyke Brown, Burnt Umber, and Indigo Extra, which is a cool blue. Using that number 10 synthetic flat, I'm keeping the paint fluid and liquid mixed down with my medium, but I'm also trying to get some of that tonal value right from the start. Now here I go in with the greens. I'm using a combination of the Spectrum Green Light and Australian Green Gold. Once again, I'm using relatively thin paint at this stage. You can see I'm now mixing a little bit of that Naples yellow in. I've actually got a combination of a few different yellows on the palette at the moment, including cadmium yellow light, Naples yellow, and transparent iron oxide yellow, all of which are included in these mixes. You can see what I'm trying to do, even though I'm blocking in the painting, because I've got my underdrawing right. It's allowing me to effectively break down the painting into easily manageable areas of light and shade. So obviously when I blocked in the darks, that gave me a really good base. It solidified my composition, and now it's allowing me to concentrate on getting some of these lighter values in. I'm also looking at the darks, and here I go in using one of my favorite landscape painting colors called Olive Green Dark. It's a little bit like the green equivalent of Burnt Umber. Now I return to this mix of green gold and the Spectrum Green Light. Now I'm keeping the paint pretty thin and fluid so I can block in these areas quickly. The reason I'm doing that is I want to layer up to my final colors. So by the end of this painting, there'll be at least 3 or 4 layers on every single part of the canvas. Some of them will be a little bit thicker and others not so much. Now I'm adding that titanium white into the mix. That's desaturating the paint, And it's also lightening the tone of the paint as I move on to the distant background. Now I'm going to go back over that background again, but I like to work the painting up as a whole, which means not leaving areas behind. Here you can see me going through and putting a second layer on the darks. Now there's only so far I can go now because the paint is wet on wet. However, because I kept the underpainting really thin, it's allowing me to put a second layer down before the end of the day. I start by adding in some details with my number 0 filbert. Now what I tend to do is once I've got the composition really locked in, like I did manage to get to a point on day 1 where I felt like the composition was not going to change much from there. Now this allows me on day 2 to start adding in some of these details in areas that I feel may have been a little bit neglected. Now as with everything on the painting, these areas are all going to receive at least 3 or 4 separate layers before they're finished. I'm just taking the opportunity to put in some of the structural underpainting that will allow me to imply detail in the finished painting. By that I mean I'm not really going for a photographic end result. What I am going for is something that up close looks juicy and painterly, and when you step back it appears real. You can see me here using that same number 0 filbert to apply some of the detail into the foreground areas of the painting. Now this foreground area is interesting in the sense that it's not an absolute foreground. In fact, I've cropped the immediate foreground out of the painting to create visual depth between the viewer and the subject. Now speaking of visual depth, I move back on to those distant hills in the background. But once again, not forgetting some finer details. I love painting the entire painting up as a whole. Some people like to work certain areas of a painting up from start to finish, but me personally, I find it works better for creating visual harmony and a balanced painting if I treat the painting as a whole and work it up in stages, not leaving areas behind for too long. Now obviously you have to spend a bit of time working on certain areas, more so than others. In this case, I'm spending that time redefining the background. Now you may not have seen because I was shooting a time lapse, but I actually blended that background out after I blocked it in. This can help to create a feeling of visual perspective, but if you do too much blending, it also just looks fuzzy and out of focus. So what I'm doing here with my number 10 flat is redefining those shadows. Obviously I've desaturated the blue using a combination of Old Holland violet grey, zinc titanium white and ultramarine blue. There's a few other little trace elements in there as well. There's some of that Fragonard red brown in there, which is warming up the mix. Now you can see me going from the shadows back to the highlighted areas in the background. There's a lot of toing and froing as with anything that I do. But I'm at a stage now in the painting process where I want to bring this area up to as close to a point of finish as I possibly can. So let's speed it up a little bit. You can see me here using a combination of blending and redefining areas to give the effect of those hills receding back into space. Now when I'm happy with that, I decide it's time to pay a bit of attention to the visual perspective created by these shadows. You can see I desaturate, and as I move forward I actually boost the saturation in the foreground. This is all part of creating the feeling of visual depth. Once that's done, I move back on to adding in fine detail, this time using my number 0 flat. There's quite a lot of brushwork going on here, and I'm sped it up, but I'm doing the second and third passes on some of these detail elements. Now I mentioned that I've boosted the saturation towards the foreground. I've achieved this in the shadow areas by using a combination of Van Dyke brown and Prussian blue in almost equal parts. And this will produce a deeply saturated blue-black. Here I go again, trying to redefine those shadows and getting that saturation right, and then moving back through the brushes and redefining areas of detail. Because of the type of lighting that I've incorporated into this painting, I've been able to split it up into more easily manageable areas of light and shade. This has also helped me throughout the painting process to dedicate time to working on the shadow areas and then going back and working up those highlights. Now up close you can see that even though I have been using reasonably small brushes, I'm still painting deliberately with quite a loose painterly style. Here I am mixing up some of those shadow tones. I'm using Prussian blue, unbleached titanium, ultramarine violet, and also a little bit of Fragonard red brown in this particular mix. I've built up a few layers and now it's really time for me to focus on getting that saturation right. I start with the hills in the mid background. Now I'm lightening everything up here, and as I move forward the shadows will become more saturated. This is really important for creating that effect of visual perspective. The general rule is the further things recede into space, the lighter and bluer they appear. Now this is a mix of Prussian blue, a little bit of zinc titanium white, and some of that Fragonard red brown. The Fragonard red brown is actually warming up that mix, otherwise it would be a lot cooler. I want to have it warm, but I don't want it too purple. You can see as I work the paint out of the brush there, that Prussian blue does tend slightly towards a greener blue than maybe ultramarine. But I find sometimes ultramarine, especially if you're mixing in a transparent red like that red brown, can sometimes end up a little bit too purple, which is not something you very often see in real life. I might not get this exactly right the first time, but that's okay because ultimately I like to layer up to the end result, so it's never a waste of time. I just have to go over it as many times as I see fit. Now what I'm doing here is, if you have a look at the far left of the composition, you'll see I've got a slightly different color mix than what I do on the right. The reason for this is because the light is actually raking in from the right hand corner. This is slightly altering the shadows and actually making them have more contrast on the right hand side. It's pretty subtle, but it's these subtle variations of tone that can create an interesting, naturalistic looking painting. Here I'm using that number 6 long flat. It's quite a nice brush to use for things like this because you can really load those bristles up with paint. You can see me just adjusting that mix every time I go back to the palette. Once again, I'm lightening it up even more on that left hand side. You can see me dashing into that old Holland violet grey, which is one of my favourite colours for painting desaturated shadows like this. Now using a medium-sized brush like the number 6 long flat is great because using the side of the brush you still have a lot of control. You can push paint up to edges and get a really nice sharp definition. You can also blend as you go, and you'll see me doing this through the process of painting these shadows, as there is a subtle blend as I move towards the midground, and the closer to the picture plane that I come, the darker the shadows will be. Now here I'm actually deciding to put in the top edge of that hill.
Using once again that Fragonard red brown and a little mix with some of that unbleached titanium this time. There we go, a little bit of that unbleached titanium. There's a little bit of raw umber in there too. It's pretty important for me to get these transitional areas right on the painting. So once I've redefined them, what I'm actually looking to do is have a nice soft blended line between the shadow and where it meets the light. This is going to take me a few attempts. Anyway, I'm sidetracked by this tree at the top.
That warm brown you see is burnt umber.
So I've gotten that way too bright. And I knock it back with a bit of Prussian blue. Now it's time for me to pay some attention to those transitional areas. As well as highlights, I'm adding in some midtones, including mixes of burnt umber, transparent iron oxide brown, and Naples yellow. I'm also lightening and desaturating these mixes using zinc titanium white and unbleached titanium. Now throughout the entire process of this painting, I'll go in, block in areas, and then look to redefine them. I like moving through the brushes. Sometimes if I think I've put in too much detail, I'll go back and knock it back with a larger brush again. Sometimes I'll blend out, and other times I'll come back in over passages of blending or structural brushwork and reiterate detail. You can see me here, I'm quite far on in the painting process now, and I decide that it's a good idea to really start paying some attention to the detail areas in the foreground. Now, as I mentioned before, this foreground is not an immediate foreground. In fact, I've cropped the painting so that there is no immediate foreground visible. This is designed to create spatial depth between where the viewer stands and the picture begins, creating that effect of visual perspective, as if the viewer is looking off into the distance at these hills. Now, very carefully, start defining some of this detail, which is going to capture the viewer's attention as their eye enters into the painting. This really is quite a process. I'm using this number 0 filbert and literally takes several days of going over and over areas of detail, slightly adjusting mixes as I go. At various points I actually think that I've gone as far as I need to, and then I look at the painting again and realize that this is a very, very important element of the painting. The reason for this is it is the area of the painting that has the most detail. It's designed to capture the viewer's attention when they look at the painting and draw the eye in and through the composition. It's also quite a complicated area. There's all these ruts that are created by erosion and also sheep walking along the sides of these steep hills. These are very characteristic features of this landscape, and as I know the landscape so well, I feel like it's really important to get these in. At the end of the day, it really is worth me taking the time to put them in. Now, you can't see my hand because it's out of shot, but you can see the mailstock that I've got there. I'm resting my hand on this mailstock to give it extra stability for making some of these fine detail adjustments. This mix that I'm using here is very heavy on a color called olive green dark. This is a color produced by Old Holland, and it's one that I really like. It's got a very deep saturation. Here you see me going in with actually quite a bit of Van Dyke brown on the brush. I decide that these trees have been left behind a little bit and need some attention. I think I just needed a break from all that fine detail work. It can be exhausting at times, but is made a lot easier by building up to these final results. Now you can see from this close-up shot that there are a lot of layers going on. I've built up the paint to this final coloration, going from, in some cases, quite a dark green right up to ochres, and those transparent iron oxide yellows are really visible in these shots. If you've never used transparent iron oxide yellow before, an easy way to introduce it to your palette could be as a substitute for yellow ochre. Now I actually use both, but they can be used in similar mixes. Now back to the painting. This detail work is exhausting. One thing that I do is constantly kind of remind myself that no matter how long it takes, all of the paintwork, all of the brushwork, all of the layers, they all build up to an end result. Now, in my mind, I have a vision of how I want this painting to end up. Sometimes there are stumbling blocks, I'm not gonna lie. I think at this stage, I was probably just a little bit tired, but I kind of couldn't achieve that tonal contrast that I was after with the level of detail. I actually decide to put the painting aside for a little while, wait for it to dry, and then I come back for the sixth and final pass. Now this is actually, I think it's almost 2 weeks after. I put the painting aside, but I looked at it every single day I was in the studio. I was working on some other stuff. I got out to do a little bit of plein air painting as well. And I came back to it refreshed and reinvigorated. So I sharpened up my little number 0 filbert and hit this detail area again. It's probably worth pointing out that the rest of the painting remains the same as in the last pass. I didn't change anything else. I just kept on working on this detail in the foreground. If you look at the bottom left corner of the painting, you'll notice that I'd even signed it optimistically, thinking that I'd finished. But the more I looked at the painting, the more I realized that it just needed a little bit of extra work up here in this detail. And ultimately, I'm glad that I did. Sometimes it's a great idea to step back a little bit, and it actually allows you to uncloud your mind and see what you're doing there. I often do this. I'll work on more than one painting at a time, and this gives me a chance to put things aside so I can look at them objectively, and also to leave paintings to dry for days and even weeks in between layers. This can help a lot with the layering process, especially when working in oils. Now, because I hardly use any medium in my paint, sometimes, especially in winter like right now, these paintings can take a little while to dry. Here I'm adding some really subtle tonal variation, highlights, and then going back in with some midtones to try and create a sense of volume in this foreground element to the painting. It's always really important for me at this stage to look at the painting as a whole. When I feel like I've achieved a sense of visual harmony and balance, then I can happily say that the painting is complete. Now when we zoom in on these foreground elements, you'll still see there's lots of funky mark making. If it looks painterly and loose up close and comes together when you step back, that's exactly the effect that I'm going for. Hi there, and thanks for watching. Now hopefully the information contained within this video is enough to inspire you to pick up the brushes and start experimenting. I personally learned to paint through trial and error. In fact, when I went to art school, they told me painting was dead, and back in those days, we didn't even have the internet, so I just had to knuckle down and experiment. Now, over the years, I've made so many mistakes, but as long as I was learning through that process, I knew that I was doing something right. So what I want you to get from these videos is it's okay to try out ideas, to find your unique voice as an artist, to find what works for you. So with that in mind, pick up those brushes and start painting.